please remember to mute your motion if you're not asking a question. And if you do have any questions, please include them in the chat next to us, and we will get to that around 30. So from there, I'll let you take it away, Phong.
Yes, please. No more interruption, Nikki.
None more. Yeah.
I'm gonna get to the heart of the matter here, because I know that we'll be talking about the film very quickly on Barbara Rubin, which I thought was marvelous. It's a great film. You did an amazing film there for all of us, really. But I wanted to start first because I mentioned earlier, we met in 94, 90, I think 94, 95, just a year or so before Maya Shapiro died. You come to interview both Maya and Lillian about Forrest Bess. I mean, no one knew Forrest Bess at the time except for a handful of artists in New York community. Maybe Bill Jensen, maybe Chris Martin, maybe
John Yap.
Yeah, so let's start a little bit there, because obviously you have an appetite for artists or anyone who sort of followed their unusual path. And so Forrest Bess was one of them. And so let's ask the first question. How did you get to know Forrest Bess? His book?
Basically, because through John Yao, who was teaching at SVA, and my wife was going to school there at SVA. And, you know, that show in 1988 at Herschel and Adler Galleries was an amazing show. Yes. And everybody who saw that was very much impressed. And so when I saw that show, I knew there was a story there. And then you heard these, you know, vague, you know, talk about his weird life as well. And then I just thought, I want to learn more. And then a couple of years later, I dug into it. And when I learned that Maya and Lillian were still around, I mean, you walked into their brownstone. It was quite amazing just walking in there, because it seemed like you were going back in the past. And,
yes.
And seeing their Forrest Bess paintings on the wall, and it turned into a great story.
Yeah, I mean, basically, to me, that was the beginning of so many other artists who soon after became more interested. And John essay for the catalog at Herschel and Adler, those I think that for the show was very informative, wonderful introduction, because he also delved into the the back and forth correspondence.
Yeah, and
himself and
yeah,
Bess.
I should mention there's again a very good show in Germany now, in Kassel, Germany. I was about to go there to talk, but it's another Forrest Bess show, the first one in Germany in 30 years. And so later this summer, they're going to extend it. So if anyone's in Europe, in Kassel, Germany, there's another great show, which will be, you know, equally as impressive, because whenever you put his paintings together, you know, they talk to each other and they talk to you, and they're very small and they invite you in. And you know, so it's great. But yes, I mean, I love outsider people, and I always look for those kind of people, and certainly Forrest Bess and Barbara Rubin have a lot in common too.
Yeah, I was thinking of that. So just how would you describe for some younger artists who might not be familiar with Bess, how would you describe the work or his life really in one or two sentences?
I would just say that he painted right from his body more than his mind. I mean, he had dreams, but the dreams came through his body. So it was, you know, I mean, I think he would have been diagnosed maybe with bipolar at one point, and he certainly had issues being a gay man in Texas during the 50s. But he lived you know, he was a fisherman, and he would paint his dreams. He was very much into Jungian theory. And I love Jung too. And, you know, he would talk to these fishermen about Jung, and I just love the idea of them out there fishing for shrimp and fish, and then talking about Jung and dreams. And so he was a very, he had intuitions, and he painted what he felt. And I think that comes across. And everyone who looks at his paintings, you know, students say, oh, looks like I could do that. And they try to start to do it and they can't. So because deeper than that. So, and there's something great about the simplicity of his paintings, but how deep they are.
Yes, it's true. I mean, I remember talking to Maya Shapiro, and he told me a great deal about his best remarkable interest, self-taught interest, because he came to Shapiro's lecture on Freud in 1952 in University of Texas in Austin. And there, you know, thereafter, not only that he wrote to Shapiro, he often called on the telephone. So they had extensive conversation on the telephone about how he were able to reach out to Carl Jung. I think Shapiro might have given him the address, and same thing with how he got in touch with John Money, the distinguished doctor and psychologist at Johns Hopkins University, who's known for his work on sexual identity and the biology of gender. So he was amazing how he can gather all the information and were able to maintain a correspondence with all of these people.
Well, they were his sort of intellectual connection, because he lived in such a primitive place. But yeah, and they all, and Meyer especially, would never put him down. You know, he would get pretty way out there in his theories, and they wouldn't question him. I think Betty Parsons, his dealer, started questioning him a bit, but they understood that that was the source of his painting, and Meyer respected that. And yes, he wrote letters to Carl Jung. I never saw a letter back. Oh, no, he did. Carl Jung wrote a letter back. He wrote one letter back.
So did John Money, I think. Yes.
Oh, John Money sent many letters to Forrest Bess, but Jung did write one, and he said like, you're onto something. And, and Bess he took that and ran with it. He was like, yes, Carl Jung believes I'm on the right track. So, yeah, what a different time that you could write to Carl Jung and get a response. That's great.
So Chuck, how did you manage to get people like Willem Dafoe to narrate the movie?
Well, listen, I mean, with any of these people, and with Barbara Rubin too, they know they're special. And actually, Willem came through Ari Markopoulos, the photographer and filmmaker who helped me do the film. So shout out to Ari, who was a big help and did all the camera work. But Ari knew Willem, and you know, the second we asked him, he said, "Oh, I love Forrest Bess." So you find that like little pockets of people who are in the know or hip to these kind of things love it, and you know, and so he did it for free. I loved his, you know, his voice was great. It worked out really well. We didn't coach it at all in any way, and he just bought into it and did it well. And Ruth Malachek, who was a great theater person from like Mabu Mines and La Mama, did some narration for the film too. So I was really happy that Willem and Ruth both did it for free, of course. And so yeah, that's great.
Remarkable. And not to mention Robert Thurman, the Buddhist scholar.
Well, Thurman's an interesting thing, because he loved Bess, because before he even did the Tibetan thing and did any of his own investigation, he met Bess cold, and Bess was his introduction to the strange Kundalini theories and Jung and everything. And so Bess Thurman knew right away that he was meeting a special person, and kept in touch with him, and then went on his own journey, and of course became a great Tibetan scholar.
Yeah, that's amazing. Okay, so let's go right into it. I know that you've done a lot of different things to keep your production afloat. You know, just like I remember somebody asking, Robert Graves, he wrote so many well-known historical novels, like I, Claudius,
Yep.
Also known to a smaller circle as a poet. I knew him as a poet, but how he did it, when he was asked how he maintained the two, he said, well, it's like I raised my fancy dog to sell them in order to feed my cats.
Yeah.
A lot of that. You did a lot, you know, Street Story with Ed Bradley at CBS. You work with Michael Moore on TV Nation for Fox News and National Geographic, tons of it, and other things, Discovery Channel. And then you're able to do this film on Barbara Rubin. So let's share with us how did that all began, because I don't think we ever experienced anything like it comprehensively.
Yeah, it's just like you said, it's just doing stuff for work in television. I mean, I love the work I always did in television. It was great because you learn about one thing and then move on, whether it's Alaska pilots or I worked in emergency rooms with doctors, filming them a lot. And I just, as you get older, maybe it's a young person's game. I mean, I didn't want to be in the field for 2 or 3 weeks anymore. And I just thought I'm always looking for these kind of people. So a guy named Johan Kugelberg, who runs the Boohoo Ray Gallery, I went to talk to him about another idea. And he right away, he had just had a show with Barbara Rubin stuff. He was one of the few people who knew Jonas and the love for Barbara. And he said, do you know who Barbara Rubin is? And I said, no. And he told me, and within a minute, I thought, oh, this is a great idea. So, and once you get that inspiration to do it, it just kept going. And then right away, I contacted Jonas and, you know, and I would do jobs in between, but I kept working on this. And then I had to take a whole year off to edit it. And it worked. But, you know, I ended up doing it all myself because I couldn't afford to hire anyone to work on the film, except for my cameraman, Andy Boley. So that's just the only person. But anyway, so you just get it done. And if it comes from, like Forrest Bess paintings, if it comes from deep within you and you really have to do it, you know, if I had been assigned something, it might not work as well. But I found this woman, and the more you learn about Barbara and the more I talk to people everybody who ever met her remembered her exactly. And you realize that this is a special person. And of course, Jonas always knew she was a special person and wanted to do something. So that helped me. And it was really a partnership at certain points with Jonas.
Yeah.
And he gave me all his footage to go through and use. And that was a gift because he filmed everything in the 60s. And he had film of Barbara as well, but he had film of just New York City and everybody else, and Ginsberg and the Velvet Underground. And so when he said, use what you want, I was in a playground.
Did you manage to meet her ever before she died in 1980?
No, not at all. And, you know, very few people would have met her after 73 because she moved to France. So nobody in New York had seen her for many, many years, or for like 8 years before. Then she died. So she disappeared and then died. So it's even more of she was alive in France for a while with her Hasidic community, but people had already forgot who she was. And you know, so she had drifted into just people's memory because there wasn't even much documentation of her in the cultural history of New York, which is why I hope to bring that forward. When you went digging for it, you could see that she actually was everywhere if you knew who she was. And there's so many stories of me going, meeting people who say, you know, oh, I kept wondering who that person with the short dark hair was because she was everywhere. Yeah. And then I'd say that was Barbara Rubin, and you'd find them and be able to use those photographs. And it was great.
Yeah, you know, it makes us think of how special also Jonas was in recognize these people. I mean, it's probably in the stretch of 3 or 4 years, all of his assistant, including people like Yoko Ono. Yoko was probably 17. Barbara was what, 16 when she came, or 17?
Yep. 17.
17. And so was Amy Taubin.
Yep.
Who's my...
Yeah, Amy's great. And she's in the film too. Yeah, Jonas, who was a little bit older, you know, everyone has to remember he was about 15 years older than everybody, and had such experience coming from the war-torn Lithuania. But he was he gravitated towards younger people because they had the energy that he had. I mean, there's not many, you know, late 30s or 40-year-olds in New York who have the energy of a 17 or 18-year-old, but he did, and he gravitated to those people with energy, and nobody had more energy than Barbara Rubin, and so he was transfixed when he met her, and really throughout his whole life. I mean, you knew him. He was always drawn to younger people who are doing exciting things because he was a child inside, and that's what helped him to live to 96. I mean, you know, every day was new, and he was always discovering things, and that he recognized that kind of openness in Barbara and encouraged it, whereas everybody else in her life discouraged it. You know, in the 60s, it was still a very sexist time, and you find that a lot of free thinking women from that period were actually locked up or given drugs or put away. You know, the boys, free-spirited boys, had sports, and they were forgiven for their transgressions. But if a young woman was doing drugs or sexually active or exhibiting happy behavior, normal happy behavior, they were thought of as a threat to society.
Yeah.
And a lot of Barbara's friends were put away in institutions, and Barbara herself spent some time in places. And so anyway, Jonas provided a safe haven for these women who were ostracized for their creativity or their excited natures. You know, Naomi Levine is another one. She was a, you know, Warhol, she was in some Warhol films and made films of her own. And her life didn't end so well, but Jonas loved these people, and for all the right reasons.
Yeah, how would you describe Barbara's relationship to both Warhol and Dylan, Chuck?
Oh boy. I mean, I think there was a different thing there. I guess to take Warhol first, it was, you know, Warhol had a complicated relationship with women, and sadly, there's a Warhol show at the Warhol Museum that was just opening next week, but the museum's closed now. But it was called The Femme Touch or something. It's about Warhol and the women in his life. But many of them were, you know, transvestites or other types. But Barbara was the only one who was a very strong-willed and creative person who had a lot of ideas. And Andy loved ideas, and nobody had more ideas than Barbara. They didn't always work out, but she was ready with them all the time. So I think he was drawn to her because of her ideas and her energy as well. And you know, she had to exist in a factory that was very dominated by strong men who didn't appreciate her input. But, you know, Lou Reed appreciated it, and Warhol appreciated it. So I guess he was drawn for the ideas and her filmmaking. I mean, she knew how to run a camera, and he needed people to run cameras, and he could trust her. And her camera work is crazy, but it added an element that he liked, you know, a little unusualness to the tripods and stuff. So that's Warhol. Dylan, it was more a, you know, I mean, Dylan was very famous when she first met him, and they met through Ginsberg. And I think he just needed someone like that in his life too, who was a little more rebellious. I mean, he didn't want to get too mainstream, and he recognized that Barbara had the pulse of another scene in New York. It wasn't the folk scene. It was a very cool scene with wild people, and he was an explorer too, and loved to write songs about fringe people. And so he met interesting people through Barbara, and you know, I think they had a relationship as well. I think there was an attraction there as well. And so she went on to just you know, she babysat for him, and she was there for him beyond them being a boyfriend girlfriend.
She got everything she needs. She's back. Is that dedicated to her?
Wait, what was that again?
That song, Bring It All Back Home. Remember, from the 5th album, came out. 65. She's got everything she needs. She's an artist. No.
Yeah. Well, let me be very clear. I just made that connection that Dylan has never, I don't think he's ever admitted that any of his songs are about anybody, and he never would. So, I mean, you know, Like a Rolling Stone is about Edie Sedgwick, and this movie, that's, I mean, I think, and most people think, but he's never said that. So I don't want to say that Dylan wrote that for Barbara or anything. I just think it reminded me of Barbara, and it was right around the same time, and her picture is on the back of that album. So I picked that song, and his people said fine. So that's all I can say. But no one ever can get inside Bob's head.
Okay, cool. So let's one more or few more questions, Chuck, before we open up to our friends here. When you came to the Rail for lunch, we talked briefly of how unique and singular her relationship with Allen Ginsberg were. So could you talk a little bit what you initially started?
Yeah, I think, you know, Alan had a group of people who sort of, I mean, again, I think he was attracted to her energy, just like any poet. If you're writing, you want something to write about, and she would inspire you in lots of ways. But he also depended on her, like he depended on other women and some men in his life to sort of take care of him. And so when he would be off touring and giving, you know, reading poems all over the world, Barbara would stay at home in the apartment and take care of Peter Orlovsky and run the household sometimes. So they had a sort of, I mean, I think they met at like a free love commune on the Lower East Side. So, you know, there were always orgies and sexual things going on. But at a certain point, it became a mothering thing. Barbara was very good at taking care of people, and Alan needed taking care of sometimes. And she also was in love with Alan. And because he was Jewish, I think she earlier on, even before she converted and all that, she was attracted to him because on that basic level because of their Jewishness. And he was less shy about being Jewish than like Dylan. So anyway, and I think, so there was a mutual affection there that was both creative, but also practical.
Yeah.
And yeah.
So, okay, another question I love to ask, burning one, is, you know, that period when she made, you know, the great film, Christmas on Earth, that was sort of came right after Jack Smith Fleming Creature. So that's a reference that we most can identify with. But as far as what's going on at that time, what Brackett was doing, what Ken Jacob was doing, and everyone else was doing, Jonas and other avant-garde filmmaker, how would we put her work in that context, Chuck?
Yeah, I think it would be firmly in the experimental branch of that scene. You know, the people who were around the co-op, which Jonas ran, were some pretty straight-laced people and then some crazy people. So I would say Brackage was pretty straight-laced, but Jerry Joffin and Jack Smith were drug-addled crazy people in some sense, and they made great films, but it was a different type of thing. So Barbara was sort of bridging the both of them, but I think she watched everybody's movies and decided to go further. And as a woman, you know, Christmas on Earth, she just pulled out all the stops and said, what can I do that'll just, she loves shocking people. So clearly she wanted to shock people. And so I think her early filmmaking was all about shock and awe. And we can do whatever we want. And of course, Jonas was always a proponent of that too. Just shoot whatever. And it's a, you know, it's a film. Great. So I think she was definitely on the way fringes of all these. And she never had a chance to sort of integrate into there. And I don't know if she ever would have successfully become a filmmaker like her friend Shirley Clark, who made way more traditional movies. in the independent scene, and became about as successful as a woman filmmaker could be, would be Shirley. And Shirley and Barbara were good friends.
Yeah.
But by that point, Barbara had sort of, I mean, she never had any money to make films either. We got to remember that Shirley Clark came from a pretty well-to-do family, so she had money. And Barbara was always borrowing cameras from either Jonas or Andy. It wasn't easy to make a traditional film. So she just really explored the experimental and strange projections. I mean, she loved, multimedia events. I mean, she really loved the cacophony of that. And that's why the Velvet Underground, the Exploding Plastic Inevitable, was such a great thing, because she totally pushed that. And even after she didn't do it for the Velvets, she was doing it. I just read something in Jonas's diaries, his great New York diaries, which are out now, about her having like 8 projectors in a room with bands playing in the middle, and the projectors were playing all around, on the ceiling, on the floor. And I would have loved to have seen that. Of course, there's no documentation, but she started organizing these crazy installations, which she wasn't the only one doing that. I mean, Gerd Stern and the USCO people were doing really cool things. Yes. But Barbara was totally into experiential filmmaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good place to stop and see whether we can get some question going here. Nikki, can we begin with the first?
Yeah. Well, again, thank you, Chuck, for joining us, and thank you for, shining a light on these really important people that may not get the fame and glory like Warhol gets. But I do want to take it to Charlie. Charlie had a question, and I will let Charlie ask.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Chuck. Great to hear all those stories. My question is, with so many relationships with historically significant artists, how did you think about structuring a narrative for the film?
That's a really good question, because, it was a mess. I mean, her life included so much stuff, and it was very hard to think what I'm going to focus on. And so time didn't work for me at all. Like doing it chronologically was not going to work, because everything overlapped. There were periods that were very intense for her. So really, like you said in the beginning of your question, I did it by personality. So I tried to tell her story through the people she met as she met them. So the film goes along that way, and it doesn't really you don't understand completely that like the Dylan period overlaps the Velvet Underground period, but it does. But I do it just by character. And of course, Jonas starts it because she did meet Jonas first. And Alan, I think, ends it because Alan is where the farm was, and that was her last period. I can't remember the order, but I was having real trouble editing it. Because, well, if you edit anything or even television, you have these things called blocks, or like chapters in books. So I had a whole bunch of good chapters, and I was like, okay, how do I put these chapters together? And then it kind of works. And if you watch the film, you can see there's very clear chapters that start and stop. And I think that helps people follow the through line of the story. So also Barbara's emotional state and what she's doing creatively, moves through the film as well. And like any good movie, right around halfway or a little bit further, there's the, what's it called? The climactic moment, or there's a turn. And so I actually had a chapter called The Turn, where things change in some fundamental way. And that's always important for a longer film, to have some dramatic climax.
Yeah, it's true.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you, Charlie.
It looks like John has a question now, so I will give the floor to them.
Hey, thanks for joining us, Chuck. Super fun to watch, to see your film. I mean, obviously just seeing all of those like super kind of famous people hanging out together is like beautiful and inspiring. One of the things that struck me about the film was the extent to which Judaism kind of became like a character or was a character. I think I had learned about Barbara. I'd heard her story as like she was there and then she was just not there. So the extent to which she maintained kind of contact with her old life while she was living as an Orthodox Jew in New York was interesting. And also just what was it like to work with that community, which I think gets a reputation for being extremely insular. That are footage and talking to the rabbis, I found it all really fascinating.
Yeah, I did too. And at first, there was probably going to be more of that in it, because her children are all still Hasidic, and I actually met 3 of them, or talked to one on the phone and met 2 others. So that story was very interesting to me from the beginning. And so you may not know this, but sort of the Werner Herzog, the voice of God that's in the movie, it's sort of a narrator. From the very beginning, it tells like pieces of Jewish wisdom. And all of those quotes are from a book that Barbara's husband wrote after she died. So you don't know that, and I didn't say anything in the film, but it's like a way of putting his presence in the movie from the very beginning. The husband who she would meet and fall in love with, and who was a painter himself, but also devoutly Hasidic, he's there the whole time. So you sort of have hints of where the story's going. And because really it's wisdom, it's from any and all religion. I do put all religions together. So, old Jewish wisdom is as good as any, as old Arabic wisdom, whatever, and provides guidance. So you hear his voice through the film, and that's a way of keeping the Judaism in the film when it's not even there at all. And, I think you got to remember that Barbara came from a period where they were like red diaper babies. There were Jewish people in New York who were very non-religious, but who were first generation, immigrants in New York, and had forgotten their past. And I think that was very much a feeling in the 60s. So one of the stories right away that I discovered, I was like, wow, there were some hippie rabbis. There were crazy people who were talking about this stuff. And we usually think about the 60s, we think about swamis and gurus and Buddhism and the Maharishi. But there was this undercurrent, especially in New York, of these hippie rabbis and strange people like, who came from that, whose fathers and grandfathers were rabbis. What's his name? Lionel Zip. Anyway, so there's some very strange people on the Lower East Side who were into that world, and Barbara slowly met them, and that became a big part of her life. But yeah. So, and then your second question was about what was the other thing?
Just what it was like to connect with those rabbis and kind of like enter that community a little bit.
Yeah. So I actually went to Israel. I'd never been, and I went to Jerusalem and met her kids. That's a huge story, but basically they lived in a very isolated Hasidic community outside of Jerusalem, and it was another world. And I did want people to understand what that world was like, and I did some interviews with people, but it really is a little distracting. And I kind of, I didn't want to spend too much time there, but her children wanted me to do a film about their father. He said, oh, he's fascinating because he's a famous, well-known rabbi in Israel. And so in a way I did, like I said, put him in the movie with the narration. But yeah, I went up to Svat. Actually, one of the old experimental filmmakers lives in Svat now. I'm blanking on his name now, but he knew Jonas and everybody, but he also converted and moved to Israel. So anyway, I think there was this undercurrent of interesting things in the 60s that were related to Judaism. And it was really interesting to think about it because it was uncool until way later. Like the Kabbalah, I think Madonna was the one who made the Kabbalah well known as a groovy thing, but that wasn't until the 80s or 90s. So, but all that was going on. And that to me was another untold story, which I didn't really get into as much, but it was fun to discover. And I learned that Hasidic people can drink alcohol. I learned all these things I didn't know. I mean, you think it's a very, they are very insular, but they also are pretty normal in some respects. And
Thank you.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Also just going to input there that, yes, it was the late 90s with Madonna popularizing Kabbalah thanks to the Jivamukti brand of yoga.
Yeah.
With that, I will give it to Jeremy, who has a question.
Hey, Chuck. Thanks for joining us from the outdoors. It's nice to see trees and.
Let me know if you see any. Let me know if you see any people behind me, and I'm going to run. Hi.
I will. I will. There was one Bigfoot, but that's about it. I wanted to know, as you, it's always so fascinating to hear these historical figures and how they connected, and sometimes you didn't realize like they overlapped or even like lived together or just shared space and community together in various ways. And as you've gone into these lives, I'm really curious, what have you learned around the dynamics of community, and like what are some of the things that are not showy, that are just kind of hidden in the background that really made this possible? Like some of the dynamics of all these people coming together and the work. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I hate people who say, oh, that was such a better time and the 60s are so cool and we can't do that. I mean, I honestly am a big believer in these kind of communities that interact with music, with poetry, with theater, with film, are still happening. So I don't want to glorify the 60s in any way, but it was a smaller community and they were more under attack. And I guess what I mean by that is like great art usually comes when you're fighting something. And I think every one of these communities, you forget, in the early 60s, were fighting censorship, and they were fighting the norm of a very white milquetoast society that they didn't feel a part of. So I think we're way more accepting now of everyone. And I worry that the energy of fighting doesn't give as good of, leads to great art. And I don't know what, I'm sure kids today are fighting against something, or young, communities like this. But I would say, if you want to see where really cool art is going around the world, go to the places where people are struggling, because we forget, like I said, that back then censorship was really huge. You could not show a foreign movie in New York City without getting it approved. Even a Swedish movie, a Bergman movie, had to be approved. And certainly these radical experimental movies were not allowed to be shown anywhere. I mean, Christmas on Earth still can't be shown in certain places because it's so explicit. So anyway, and even Dylan and Ginsberg were still fighting against norms. And so that's what made that community so interesting. And it was a smaller place back then, New York, and they did bump into each other all the time. And they needed each other to fight censorship. I mean, when Flaming Creatures went all the way to the Supreme Court, the ability to show Flaming Creatures was a Supreme Court case. And so whenever, Ken Jacobs and Flo Jacobs got arrested for projecting it in New York City. So when those cases came up before the court, you'd go out in the street, and who would be out there protesting? Barbara, Ginsberg, the Fugs, Ed Sanders, music people, everybody recognized this as something that had to be fought. Lenny Bruce, another great example. So Lenny Bruce was fighting censorship, and Barbara knew Lenny Bruce and really loved him. And everybody went out to try to support his case as well. So anyway, it was that fight against censorship that I think made it special for everyone, and created this avant-garde art.
Yeah, I want to add one tiny last thing here before we invite Catherine Olsen, one of our staff members, to read the poem that ends our segment today. Chuck, is that I feel there's an incredible kindred spirit, very strong bond between Jonas and Barbara, in that they share one thing. They recognize certain things are important, and they don't censor it.
Yep.
And I think when of course Barbara met Warhol through Jonas, and eventually being there witnessing the first underground Velvet Underground, she immediately called upon a photographer to come and photograph them.
Yeah.
You know, these are kind of things that we at the Rail are very conscious of archive. You know, very important for us to be mindful of that.
Yeah.
Documenting things, you know, that's how we seen things. Even when Warhol gave the Elvis Presley painting to Dylan, it fit in the car, so it tied up in the hood. Somebody filmed that. Was it John?
No, that was Nat Finkelstein, who was a great photographer at the factory. But yeah, he covered it almost like film. He took a shot every 5 seconds. So yeah, and Barbara was a real PR person herself. She really understood the importance of getting in the papers. You know, she's the one who invited the CBS News camera to come film the Velvet Underground. So she wanted people to know what was going on, and she knew that media is the way to do it. And, you know, 10 years later, she would have been a great PR person in New York if that had happened. But so, yes.
Thank you, Chuck.
Thank you, Phong.
No, this is great. Catherine, are you ready? I don't know where Catherine is.
Can you guys hear me? Good.
Oh, we can hear you. Yeah, you're all good.
Okay. The poet I'm going to read from today is Ted Berrigan, and I'm going to read from his sonnets. This is sonnet number 3. Stronger than alcohol, more great than song, deep in whose reeds great elephants decay, I, an island, sail and my shores toss, on a fragrant evening, fraught with sadness, bristling hate. It's true, I weep too much. Dawns break, slow kisses on the eyelids of the sea, what other men sometimes have thought they've seen. And since then, I've been bathing in the poem, lifting her shadowy flowers up for me, and hurled by hurricanes to a birdless place, the waving flags, nor passed by prison ships. Oh, let me burst and I be lost at sea, and fall on my knees then womanly. That's sonnet number 3.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thanks, Chuck.
Thank you guys so much.
There's more question, but we can save it for the next segment. I had at least 10 more.
Yeah. And before everyone heads out, thank you again. Please check the chat. Lewis included a link if you want a newsletter, if you don't already. And next week, we'll be joined by a lot of great guests, such as DJ Spook, Alvarez, Mackenzie Wark, Lisa Yuskevich. So stay tuned and keep joining us every day so we stay mentally healthy.
Be safe.
Great, thanks. Stay healthy.
Yep, we'll see you soon.
Thank you all.
See you all soon. Bye. Be well.